Hi, third grade. My name is Victoria, and I work for a place called the Steelworks Museum. Have you ever heard of that place before? It's the Steelworks Museum. So what do you think we teach people about when they're here? Steel. So here in Pueblo, we have a very special place called a steel mill. And it's kind of like a factory where people make steel and things out of steel. So today we're going to talk about this special place and how it's special to Pueblo's history. So I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. So here we have a picture of the museum, place where I work. Maybe you've seen it before. You see this when you're, usually when you're driving on I-25. If you haven't seen the museum, maybe you've seen this place. This is called the steel mill, where the factory is, where steel is made. So my first question is, what is steel? What are we going to be talking about today? Well, steel is a metal used to make many different things. As you can see here in this picture, steel is used to make nails. And I have a nail right here in my office that was made at the steel mill. So our mill makes all, back in the old days, they made all different size nails. They made great big ones like this, little tiny ones like you would use to hang a picture up on a wall. Steel is used to make different types of wire. So you can see this guy here, he's getting ready to pick up a big bundle of wire. And this is called barbed wire, which is like a type of wire that farmers and ranchers use to keep animals either inside their property or keep them out. Steel is used to make railroad tracks, like you see here. Trains don't drive on I-25. Cars would run them over. So trains have to go on something else, and they drive on railroad tracks. Steel is used to make bridges, like you see here. We're going to talk more about bridges in just a few minutes. Steel is also used to make big methods of transportation, like ships and cars and trains and other airplanes, other modes of transportation. That's what this picture is showing, is flat pieces that would then be turned into those different types of methods of transportation. But in order to have steel, you don't just wave a magic wand and make it magically appear. You actually have to make it. And so in the old days, you needed 4 different things in order to make steel. This one is called coal, and this was found all over southern Colorado. It was found in a place called Walsenburg. It was found near a place called Trinidad. Another place was called Canyon City. Maybe you've heard of those types of places. Another ingredient, if you want to think about it like ingredient, was this one. This is called iron ore. And this really wasn't found too close to Pueblo, but it was found in Colorado. Another ingredient was water. And this obviously is in Pueblo. It's called the Arkansas River. And you also need people in order to make steel. So in order to make steel, what the workers would do is they would dig the coal and the iron out of the earth. And this was found deep, deep, deep inside the earth in a mine. So they would dig it out, put it on a little wagon, as you can see here in this picture, and the wagon would be brought to the surface of the earth. It would be loaded onto a train, and this train would go all over southern Colorado It would go into New Mexico, it would go into Wyoming, and it would pick up the minerals and bring them back to Pueblo. And then the steel workers would do their work, and they would turn these minerals into steel products. The first thing they would do is they would burn the coal and the iron in a place called the blast furnace. And this was a super, super hot building. I'm talking like hotter than July, like super, super hot. It would get to be about 125 degrees inside the building. It would get so hot that it would actually melt the iron ore. And that iron ore would then be kind of like a river of steel inside the building. Once the iron ore was the right temperature, workers would pour the iron ore from this big container into these little molds here, and these were called ingots, and it would be allowed to cool. And then once it cooled down a little bit, the iron would get rolled and squished and squashed and flattened and made into different steel shapes for making into those different products that we talked about earlier. Here are a couple of famous things that our steel mill helped to build. Maybe you've seen some of these buildings. Maybe you've actually been inside. Of course, this is the Arts Center downtown. Maybe you've been to the Children's Museum. This place is called St. Mary Corwin Hospital. And you can imagine if you worked inside the steel mill, it was pretty hot and it was pretty dangerous. So if the workers got hurt, they would go to St. Mary Corwin Hospital that was owned by the steel mill, and the doctors and the nurses that worked there would help take care of them and help them if they got hurt at work. This tall thing downtown at Pueblo Bank and Trust is also made of steel, and it's just for decoration and to tell people what the name of the bank is. Here's another famous thing that our steel mill helped to build. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you've actually been on that bridge. This is called the Royal Gorge Bridge, and it's not here in Pueblo, it's actually in Canyon City, not too far from here. Can you think of any other famous bridges that you know about? What about these bridges? This bridge is not in Pueblo, it's actually in New York City. It's called the Brooklyn Bridge. And our steel mill helped to build the wires that are on this bridge. They're called cables in the steel mill world, but we can call them wires, that's okay. Our steel mill also helped to build the wires on this bridge. And this is another famous bridge. This one's in California. This one is called the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's in San Francisco. Here's another famous thing. I hope that you know what this one is. This is where the Broncos play, and this is the stadium called Invesco Field at Mile High, and our steel mill helped to make the steel that goes around this stadium. It's pretty neat. So back in the old days, there were lots and lots and lots of people that worked for the steel mill. And these people lived in Pueblo, and they had families, and they helped to contribute to Pueblo history. Those families of these steel workers, they had kids in them. The kids had to go to school. You know, they couldn't just run around crazy, you know, all day long. So the steel mill helped to build some schools for these children. And this is a picture. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a third grade class picture outside of their school, but this picture was taken of a first grade class. And this picture was taken probably around 1900. And this school that they built was called Bessemer Academy. And it's still a school today. It's just a few blocks away from the steel mill. And this is what that school looks like today. This is another school that the steel mill helped to build. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Central High School, and it's also not too far from the steel mill. So if you lived in the early 1900s, what do you think your school day was like? It was not too different from your school day today. There were a few differences. One of the differences is that kids in the early 1900s, they only went to school for just a couple of years. Today, kids go to school from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. But if you lived in the early 1900s, you were lucky if you made it to the 6th grade. Why do you think this was? Well, most people really didn't think education was super important like they think today. So if you made it to the 6th grade, you were doing good. Also, back then, a lot of people were really poor, and kids had to quit school around 6th grade so that they could get a job and help out their parents. Yes, even kids had to go and get a job in the early 1900s. Some of them actually worked in the steel mill themselves. Another difference is that most schools were taught in just one room. Not in one building, but in one room. So if you can imagine, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade were all in the same room. That would be pretty crowded, don't you think? Also, in the early 1900s, the school year was not September through May like it is now. It might have gone maybe September through January, maybe, and then the school year was done. Today, we have school that goes from September all the way through May because obviously education is pretty important. So they wanted to make the school year longer. Here is the 3rd grade class. I was able to find one picture of 3rd grade class, and this picture was taken in 1926. So do you see anything that's kind of the same or different from your class today? You see on the chalkboard here, today we have whiteboards or even smart boards, probably in your school. But back in the early 1900s, they actually had what were called blackboards. And the teacher would write the lessons up on the board so that the whole class could see. But you can see they were in math class. Maybe you're learning about the same type of math that these kids learned about a long time ago. If you notice how the kids are dressed, it looks like it's February, and they were probably learning about different holidays that happen in February. See this picture of Abraham Lincoln here? You know, his birthday is in February, so they were probably learning about Abraham Lincoln. This is a picture of George Washington. His birthday is also in February, so they might have been learning about the presidents and what they did for our country. Anybody have any other ideas as to what they might have been learning about? Oh. If you went to school in the early 1900s, obviously, you would have recess, just like you have recess at your school today. You know, it wasn't all learning. You had a little break and you had fun time. So have you ever played any of these games that these kids are playing? Here's a different school in the early 1900s. This is called the Pueblo Normal and Industrial School. It's not around anymore, but this is a picture of their lunchroom. So think about what your lunchroom looks like in your school. What are some things that are the same and what are some things that are different in this picture and your lunchroom? This is another picture of a school from the early 1900s, and it was called Hinsdale School, and it's not there anymore. People actually tore this school down a long time ago. But in the early 1900s, in 1909, there was a little boy, and his name was Clyde Temple. And he was in the third grade in the 1909 school year. So I want you to take a look at his report card and talk with your teacher about some things about his report card. This is another picture of a kindergarten classroom. If you think back a couple of years to when you were in kindergarten, did this classroom look anything like your classroom? If you were an interior designer, which is like a decorator, what kind of advice would you give to this teacher about how to decorate her classroom? Remember a little while ago when I was talking about how all of the kids often would be not only in the same building, but in the same classroom? Well, this is a picture of a school that was just like that. They had kindergarten classes in with the sixth graders. So what are some things that are good and some things that are bad about having a one-room school? Some subjects that kids learned in the early 1900s were kind of the same. They learned reading, they had spelling, they had math, they had history and geography, just like you do. But then they had some other different subjects. This picture shows a kindergarten class in the early 1900s, and they actually had a subject in school called gardening. And they learned about fruits and vegetables and how to grow them. They learned about when it was time to harvest them and pull them out of the ground. They learned about how fast fruits and vegetables grow and how healthy they are. This little girl is taking a class in basket weaving, learning how to make baskets. And here are a couple of samples. This is like their homework that kids in the old days would do when they took their basket classes and their weaving classes. Not only did the steel mill teach kids, but they also taught their moms and dads. A lot of people that worked for the steel mill in the early 1900s, they weren't from Pueblo. They were from all over the world. And when somebody comes into the United States from another country, this person is called an immigrant. And so these immigrants came from all over the world. They spoke many different languages, and they couldn't communicate with each other, which was a huge learning barrier. And so the steel mill decided that if all these people were going to work together, they needed to be educated and they needed to get over those learning barriers. So the company actually taught people in classes at night about different things. So this is a picture here of some men in a class. They were probably learning how to speak English in this class. These ladies here, it looks like this thing right here and this thing right here, this is a sewing machine. So they were probably teaching women how to sew their own clothes so that they would have some warm clothes in the winter. And this is a picture of a homework assignment. And this man, Hilario Gonzalez, in the early 1900s, he wanted to learn English so badly, he actually wrote and saved some of his homework. And you can see he was learning how to write sentences and how to spell words. Another thing that the steel mill helped to do is not only did they teach people in classes, but they also provided reading material so that people could understand what was happening in the United States, what was happening around Pueblo. And so they published different newspapers here in Pueblo. You can see this newspaper is called La Voce di Popolo, and it's an Italian newspaper. And the name of this newspaper, when you translate it, is called The Voice of the People. And it was written in 1927, as you can see right here. And this is a picture of some people that were in kind of like a library. And they would have lots of different types of newspapers and books and magazines to read in different languages so that they would understand what was happening. Like I said, here in Pueblo and in Colorado, and even what was happening in their home country back home. In the early 1900s, another barrier was transportation. A lot of these people lived kind of far away from the steel mill. So if you couldn't get to the class would come to you. So this picture is of a train car. You can actually visit this train car if you visit the museum. You can go inside of it. And this train would go all over Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. And it would teach the miners, remember the guys that dug up the coal and the iron? It would actually teach them about safety at work and first aid in case somebody got hurt at the mine, because mines are pretty dangerous places. And it would actually teach the miners on this train. It was like a traveling classroom. So that was another way that educational barriers were overcome, is that the class came to you if you couldn't get to the class. This picture of all these kids was actually kind of like a school bus. But instead of a school bus, it was a school train. So if they couldn't get to the school because they lived pretty far from the school, the train would come to their house and pick them up and bring them to school, which is a pretty neat idea. So does anybody have any questions for me? If so, you could talk about it with your teacher, and she is going to email me the questions. And then I will create another video to answer them. So thank you so much for listening, and hope that you learn a lot in your class, and hope that you visit the museum sometime soon.